Good morning. Hemshech Tzadik Dalet. We are on page 108, and it corresponds with Ayin Beis, volume 2, bottom of page 1149 through 1150. I noticed that on the website ayinbeis.com, they didn't yet update the pages. Maybe by now they did, but yesterday they didn't. So we'll have that updated shortly.
It's still not there yet, Rabbi.
Okay, it'll be done.
Okay, thanks.
So meanwhile, either just follow along as I read it, or if you have the Sefer would be good, or you can go on HebrewBooks.org and just look for it. You can find it there as well. But as you know, I read every line, I explain it. So technically you should be able to follow along through my reading, but it's always good to have. So we're going to put it up. Okay.
It's on the WhatsApp. The pages are on the WhatsApp if people want to look at them.
Okay, good. So we have a WhatsApp group that's dedicated to Ayin Beis, to these classes. If anybody's not on it and wants to be on it, just send your number, either chat it here on Zoom or send it to us one way or another, and we'll add you, include you into the group. And there we post resources, if there's any updates about scheduling, when the class may be canceled or postponed. So you can always follow things on that group. I always encourage, and I'll encourage, I never really spoke about it, but since we have quite a few people learning it, some of us doing it live now together in this group, some afterwards follow along on the audio or the videos. It's always wise to compare notes. It's always helpful to hear how other people understand things. And that's why I would love to also hear from you. How you understand it also helps me look deeper into it and explain it better, and perhaps get other nuances or other points that can always be added. So the dibuk chaverim, meaning dibuk, we're using the word dveikus attached to the source. So dibuk chaverim, meaning us attaching to each other and connecting, communicating, is of course a classic way of learning Torah. It started in the time already of Moshe Rabbeinu that way, and throughout the times of the Talmud, the idea of learning together. So besides what I'm explaining, to the best of my ability, interaction between you guys as well as with me, without me, even one-on-one, two people, can always add and increase, and especially comparing notes. If there's questions and things that can be that need to be clarified, you can always speak about them here through in this class. So especially when we're dealing with such intricate matters that are so like the whole map that we're addressing now, which where we are up to is we're speaking now by the third interpretation in the Ayin, in the channel. The name I use for it. Channel really is a sinner, but channel works here, field of energy, Oir, that connects, serves as interfaces between Yesh Amiti and Yesh Aniva. That's his words, Yesh, Ayin, Yesh. That's the three stages. And that Ayin divides into two. And we've learned three interpretations of this Ayin dividing into two. Now we're in the interpretation 3, which is the Ayin refers to Pnimi, the immanent energy. In other words, the energy God designated to align itself and to tailor itself to existence. And even in that energy, there's also 2 levels of Ayin, the Etzem and Ispashtus. So just like in interpretation 1, he said, there's Etzem Ispashtus in the Habligvul, meaning in the initial that comes out of Atzmus. There's Etzem and Ispashtus, the Etzem being reflecting the source, and the Ispashtus is more dealing with the function and beginning to relate to the function of the objective. Same thing in Hapnimi. In Pnimi, there's also an Etzem and Ispashtus, where the Etzem is like the source, which is, its inyan is not Hamshach and Gili. All it is reflecting what God wants of this Pnimi. That's the Etzem of Pnimi. And he said, this is attached to Eid Ein Sof. This is how it's connected to Eid Ein Sof. Not just the connection of the Kav. Post-Tzimtzum is also connected to Eid Ein Sof. But that follows a Tzimtzum and a concealment and that leap we've learned. Here we're talking about Pnimi, even pre-Tzimtzum. He doesn't say those words explicitly, even that would really help. But basically, Pnimi, the concept of Pnimi, Even without the tzimtzum, that's the atzmius of the pnimi, the first level of the ayin of the yesh amiti. So in other words, the yesh amiti in this interpretation is manifesting and reflecting in the etzem of the pnimi, k'moshe is bar the mitzvah Hashem, as he said. Vahu atzmi. I'm reading inside now. The line begins k'moshe is bar the mitzvah Hashem, page 108 in Tzadik Dal 5694. Just for the record, since many people ask, why is it printed as Sefer Maimorim Tafshin Yud Aleph? Tafshin Yud Aleph, we know, is already after the Stalkus of the Frierdiker Rebbe. Because the Rebbe, in all these years, including when the Rebbe came to America, when he started releasing in Kahos weekly publications, Kuntresim, of the Frierdiker Rebbe's Maimorim. So every week, or not every week literally, but every few weeks at least, the Rebbe would release and publish a kuntres, a small kuntres, soft cover, like 10 pages, 15 pages, which included a mimer from the Frierdiker Rebbe that could have been from any time, many of his years, often a letter and a sicha, sometimes minhagim. It was a combination, it was a kuntres that people learn. Actually, Bas Ligani that we always talk about, Bas Ligani Tavshin Yud, what was that Shabbos Tavshin Yud? The Frierdiker Rebbe's Stalkus was that morning. So this was a mimer that was prepared beforehand. And Friday night, people learned it. It was published before Shabbos. And people learned it. And that's where they noticed the Yud was missing and Shlita and other different things. That was the first kuntres of Bas Ligani of 5 chapters. Bas Ligani would end up being 4 different kuntresim because they would be the next 5 chapters, then another 5, another 5. So the Rebbe continued publishing these kuntresim even after the Stalkus of Yud Shvat, and he continued till Tafshin Yud Beis. So therefore, the kuntresim he published in the year 1951, Tafshin Yud Aleph, 1950-51, later became Sefer Maimorim Tafshin Yud Aleph, simply not because it's Maimorim of the Rebbe. We also have Sefer Maimorim of the Rebbe Tafshin Yud Aleph. This is Tafshin Yud Aleph, simply was printed then. That's when it was released. This Maimer, for example, is from Tzadik Dalet. That's not Tafshin Yud Aleph, Yud or Yud. So it's from 1933. Just pointing out for those that are wondering what's the Sefer Maimorim Tafshin Yud Aleph. Anyway, as a footnote, to get back to this, so I'm reading now from the line, V'hu atzmi, k'moshe is bar mitzvah Hashem. V'hu atzmi she'en b'chinas hamshacha v'gili be'etzem. Though it's an pnimi, which means that's its designation, it's going to be an pnimi, but at this stage, the etzem of it is an atzmi. That's not in a state of hamshacha and gili. Be'etzem. Fundamentally, it's not just lacking gilui, it's capable to be revealed and it's just not revealed. Be'etzem, it's not in a state of amshacha v'gilui. She'll say, what state is it? It's in a state that atzmus, in that atzmus wants, pnimi. So pnimi is completely involved, completely absorbed and connected to that kavana of atzmus. That's how you would call this atzmi. In this does not yet have distinctions, which is a chiddush because it's an pnimi. To say makif or higher levels of don't have distinctions or hierarchy or levels, my kamashma, of course, they're abligvul. They're all about expansiveness and unlimited and shapelessness and all of that. But here's pnimi. But because of the etzem of the pnimi, as I explained it, it's how it senses the kavana of atzmus in the pnimi. It's not yet. Doesn't have chilukim madregas. It's not about levels because it's not the function of the pnimi. It's the kavana of the pnimi. You could say the atzmius of the pnimi is fulfilling God's kavana atzmus. And in this stage, in the etzem of pnimi, it's not shaykh that it should be diminished as it extends. From level to level. That's the first level. Then comes the second level in pnimi. Remember, just as in the first interpretation, etzem and ispashtus, and the next level, the ispashtus of this air. And remember, this doesn't mean physical extension or expansion. Hispashtus is a conceptual, the functionality, its functionality, its expression. The expression of this air, that's an air that's in a state of hamshacha, transmission and revelation. because now it's beginning to start becoming an entity that has a particular function. Because Atzmus Kavana was not that Eir Pnimi should just remain Atzmus Dika. The Kavana is that it should extend and should be subject to levels, like he says. The Klolos Eir Hazeh B'chinas Shayches Ala Elamus. This Eir is not focused on its connection to its source. This is focused on its relationship with existence, because that's what its function is. Okay, that's that. Now we're going to go further. This is still basically the language of Ayin Beis, and I'll point out in a few lines from now, he's going to start elaboration of the Frierdiker Rebbe in explaining this. So the interesting twist is, like I said yesterday, just like in the first interpretation, B'chlolos, what did he say? Er b'lefnei tzimtzum is b'chlolos in general. It's considered er hakol b'atzmusei. Why? Because before the tzimtzum, it's all divine consciousness. It's all about what God wants. But in that itself, God wants that there should already be in that state of divine consciousness, in that er habligvul should begin the process of first consideration of existence, and then a deliberation, and then a determination, and then it starts taking on details, envisioning details, allocating resources, all the levels we learned. That means that even though in general it's really an Eir that is reflecting Atzmus, but Bedakus, so to speak, subtly and conceptually, there's already in the divine consciousness the beginnings of the relationship that will be related with existence, in which the tzimtzum will happen and the rest will follow. So there, the kavanah there, the main primary force is the ayin of the yesh amiti. But even there's an ayin of the yesh hanivra. That's as the spashta sa'er lifnei tzimtzum is beginning to relate, at least conceptually, to existence. Now we're talking the other way around. That er pnimi, who's in the earlier interpretations, it's seen as being relating to existence, also has within it subtly a level that's an ayin hamiti of yesh hamiti, the etzem of the er pnimi, and it has the spashtus of the er pnimi. So you see here, as I explained yesterday, but I'm elaborating more now, how every level has the other level within it, because the ayin shel yesh hamiti of third interpretation is actually the ayin of the yesh hanivra according to the first interpretation, if you think about it. So what's the answer? It's not a contradiction, because it depends what level you're talking about. In each level, we want interface. So basically, the interface is just on different levels. Because in the first interpretation, anything that relates to existence, even lifnei tzimtzum, is already an ayin of yesh hanivra, especially in the second interpretation, where it's sevev and mamala. But here, in mamala, in pnimi, he wants to demonstrate both elements as well. So bottom line, everything has everything within it, and yet each dimension, each interpretation has the focus or the emphasis is on one particular level, which in turn divides into two. Okay. Now he's going to continue with the other side of the coin regarding Ak. Just to jog your memory, you may remember that a little earlier, and Ayin Beis, it was also a little earlier, he spoke that the reason the kav, in the interpretation of the kav, creates milo mata, and that the two levels of ayin is in the kav, the top of the kav and the lower part of the kav. So he said there, that's why Ak doesn't have kalim. Because in Ak, Adam Kadman radiates the top of the kav, Reshis HaKav. And the intensity of the Eir is not yet allowed for kalim to emerge. That's why he explained this, because it's more the ayin of the yesh amiti, relatively speaking, in the kav, after the tzimtzum. He said the only thing you could say that in Ak, you have shedish neshamis the gufis. There's the root of the neshamas, the gufis, the souls that will ultimately enter into bodies later in Ishtalshlus. I explained it somewhat with a mashal like preconception and conception. At conception, which is akudim is the stage where keli emerges. One cell in the mashal of conception. What's right preconception? Remember, that cell is a result of an egg being fertilized by seed, but with God's third partner's blessing, that he's sticking a neshama into there. Because you could have complete fertility by father and mother, by husband and wife, and still God doesn't bless it with a neshama. That's why sometimes a intimate union is not going to yield a birth, a conception. So the conception requires that the Eibishter is designating an neshama that's going to enter into this body being created by father and mother. So you can say right before the actual cell develops, or the actual egg is fertilized by the seed, which will produce a cell, there's the pre, and that would be an example for Ak. It's the shadish neshama is the guf. It's the beginning, the root of when a neshama begins to relate to a body, but it's still not, they didn't actually meet, but it's right prior to it. So that's how I explained it. It's just a mashal. It's not a perfect mashal, as always, but it's something to just visualize a bit. So Ak is after the tzimtzum, which says skira achas, everything is seen. We're soon going to discuss that. It's like the general blueprint. So it's the first reality, it's the first domain after the kav. It's the first domain created by the kav. You could almost say, since we're using the analogy of a painting, let me give another analogy to help understand Ak. Remember, we talked about the artist. So pre-tzimtzum is the artist, all within the artist. First of all, determining he's going to be an artist. Second of all, determining which type of art from the infinite possibilities. And that's all still pre-actually creating art. Then comes the tzimtzum and the kav, and the canvas is he's beginning to create the art. The art is going to be an elaborate painting of 10 spheres and all the elemes from Ak through Akudim, Nekudim, Vrudim, Tikkun, Atzilus, Bri, Yitzira, Asiyah, and everything in between and over and under. Okay, but when you look at an artist, this is the part of the mashal I never really touched upon. He doesn't begin by creating one detail. He usually will create some overall sketch, like the background, the general parts, and then he'll begin filling it in. Now, I know you can say some artists won't do that. They'll begin with a detail. But very often, you begin with an overall, almost like the blueprint of your canvas. You know, where the sky will be, where the birds will be, where the grass will be, the person, or whatever the painting consists of. You could say Ak is that general blueprint. It's the whole picture in one snapshot. You ever see when they study art, you see these masters, they also sketched it before they turned it into an oil painting. You have sometimes pencil sketches or chalk sketches or whatever it is. Black, what do they call it? Like black chalk, or charcoal sketches. So in a sense, Ak is described sometimes as the blueprint of it all. So everything is there, but it's not yet broken into detail. So you can't yet call it kalim, but you can definitely call it that it's having some shape and form. Because remember, it's post-Tzimtzum, and it's called, the Alter Rebbe says that the Maggid called Ak Kloli. And he explained Kloli, we don't mean like Lifnei Tzimtzum Kloli, we mean Kloli. In existence, it's the all-encompassing snapshot. So when we talk about, as we'll soon talk about, Odom Harishon seeing all of time and all of space, Mabit Mereish Mesefe Elam Mat Sefe, he's able to see with the Shenivra B'Yem Rishon, able to see all of existence. Or Moshe Rabbeinu was shown Ad Hayama Achren, so it says Ad Hayema Achren. Before he passed away, he was shown to the Hayama Achren is the farthermost ocean, but the Medrash says Yema Achren. So this type of snapshot of all of time and space is Ak. That's why we always use the expression that Ak is the place Hashgacha Pratis, that when a wind comes and blows a leaf, what does he say? Frierdiker Rebbe from the Baal Shem Tov in Sidon Yem Yem, it's all about Machshava HaGduma Da'ak. Why do we say Machshava HaGduma Da'ak? Why don't we say Machshava HaGduma Da'atzilus or Debriya or Yetzira? Because Ak is that Machshava HaGduma that we say that Seker Hakel B'skira Achas. He gazes at it all in one snapshot. It's like the bird's eye view of everything in time and space. So Hashgacha Pratis, in that sense, is that when God's choreography, so to speak, of the general plan, we refer to that, the Machshava HaGduma Da'ak. So why am I elaborating? Because you'll see in a minute why. So now we spoke how Ak is devoid of Kalim. And all you could say is Sharish Neshama is the Gufis. But there's another side to the coin. That's Ak as you compare it to lower levels. But Ak compared to higher levels is definitely a world. We call it Adam Kadman. We call it an Adam. Yes, Kadman, Chassidus explains Adam and Kadmon seem to be a contradiction because Adam means a structure of at least a divine image of a human. Kadmon means it doesn't have a beginning. It precedes everything. It's like Gvul and Bli Gvul. So it says Ataka Ak combines the two. So Ak has two sides to it. So he's now going to speak about the other side. Now, in the first explanation of the third interpretation, he said Ak does not yet have Kalim because it's receiving it's receiving its light and energy from the top of the Kav, which is the Ayin of the Yesh Amiti. Now we're interpreting that Mamala, Pnimi, has two levels. So now he's going to explain Etzem and Hispashtus. He's going to explain now how that affects Ak. That's somewhat of an overview, so to read the next few lines. So what does he say? Well, since the second level in Er Pnimi is Hispashtus Se'er, that has some relationship to existence, and therefore, even also in Ak, Adam Kadmon, Yesh Bechinas Kalim. There's a level of containers. So before he said there was no Kalim, and he said only Nesherish Neshamas Duguf. So how could you say there are Kalim or there are no Kalim? So the answer is obvious. It's all relative. What is Kalim? Kalim does not mean necessarily a physical cup or a physical pot. A Keli is an identity. Oir is the energy of something. Keli is like the identity of it. Like Mehusa Mitzias. A simple example, the words on a page in a sefer is the Kalim. The idea it conveys, the mood it conveys, the spirit, the vibe is the Oir. They need each other. So when you think of it that way, Kalim is very relative. For example, are there Oisius in Machshava? So usually we would say Oisius, letters, develop in speech. In speech, there's letters. In Maisa, it's even more tangible. You write actual letters and words. Machshava, most of us would say, no, there's not necessarily letters. Says Chassidus, no, there is letters. They're just more subtle. They're not as defined. There's sometimes letters, but we don't even sense they're letters because there's so much focus on the light, on the energy, you don't feel the letters. You can read a book or a sefer lahavdil, be so absorbed, you don't even realize you're reading letters and words and turning pages. Why? Because you're so consumed with the story or the narrative, you don't even realize the letters are there. So the same thing with Kalim. And if you talk about objectively, the conception is when the cell becomes a cell. That's akudim. That's 10 energies in one container. And in that context, Ak doesn't have Kalim yet. It has the root of Kalim, the concept. But when you speak more, break it down, you could say in Ak there's also Kalim because the mere fact that you say preconception, Hashem has already prepared a neshama for this body. So you're right, there's no technical Keli yet because there hasn't been a physical connection between husband and wife that creates the Keli. The actual physical genetic material and DNA that will be a Keli for the neshama. But lefi erech, before Ak, the neshama has already been designated to a guf. So you can say there is conceptually some form of Keli. So that's why it's not a contradiction. It's only what you're focusing on. Earlier, we were focusing on the Kav being above existence, the higher level of the Kav, the Ayin of the Yesh Amiti. So there, the focus is Ak as it receives energy from there. So Ak is not yet defined as actual Kalim. Now, we're talking about Ak coming from the Hispashtus of Er Pnimi, which already relates to existence. So on that level, there's some relationship. So you have to always keep in mind that everything is relative in that context. Even though, for example, in the first interpretation, we said the Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra is the Oyer, Hispashtus Se'er, HaShaykh Le'elm is before the Tzimtzum. That's not even before, that's even before Ak and before the Kav. You could say, what kind of Shaykhus to Elam is? It's before the Tzimtzum. So it's in the divine consciousness. So relatively speaking, that Ayin, compared to the Ayin of Yesh HaMiti, Etzema his Pashtus is Ayin of Yesh HaNivra. If you compare it to after the Tzimtzum, all of before the Tzimtzum is Ayin of the Yesh HaMiti. Even Etzem of Er Pnimi is Ayin of the Yesh HaMiti. So it's just important to establish that and not be confused because, as I've said many times, you can't look at this mechanically. In a mechanical, physical world, a screw is not a nail. and a screwdriver is not a hammer. But in the spiritual worlds, everything is far more less tangible, and therefore there are levels that are relative to a lower level will be considered an oir. Relative to a higher level will be considered a keli. And that shouldn't surprise you because that's part of the whole process of how we understand things. Okay. So he says, that's why there's kelim. So it's not like he's contradicting. He's referring to what he said before. We called it before Sheiris Neshamas the Gufin. If you want to see exactly where that was stated, that was on page, it was in Ayin Beis on page 1150, but in Tzadik Daled, it's on page 87. If you look on 87, you see the first part of this explanation. So if you look at it before the end of the paragraph, it says, now he's calling it Sherish Neshamas. But he means it's just short for saying Sherish Neshamas de Gufus. So now he's calling it Kalim, relatively speaking, but it's in a state of Sherish Neshamas. It's not Kalim like Akudim. So he says, Akudim. And it's not comparable to Akudim. The Sham Askolas Havoyas Akeli canal. There is the beginning of the formation of the actual Keli. Canal, like where's canal? Previous chapter 21, what I just referred to, page 87. So you see the word formation of the container. It doesn't say in Ak there's a formation of a container. He says there's a level of container. That's why I explained it with the preconception and conception muscle example, just as an example. It's not the only example. There's other examples as well. I've talked about dibur shebe machshava, machshava shebe dibur. The artist, right before he begins to paint, he already envisioning what he's going to be putting on the canvas. Is that kalim or oir? So compared to the canvas, it's oir. But compared to higher levels in the artist, where he's not focusing on the structure, you can call it a keli. Or you could say the source, the shadish ha-kalim, if you wish. The same thing is once he begins painting the canvas, the outline, is that a keli or an oir? So compared to before the canvas, it's a keli because it's already getting some shape and form. Compared to the details on the canvas, it's more of an oir because it's reflecting the general picture of the image that he's going to paint. That's essentially what he's saying here, just in different language. So Nakudim is the beginning of the formation of a container, like in conception, actual container, one cell, all the energies in one cell. Aval ba'ak hurak shedish neshamas de gufus. But in Ak, it's only considered shedish, the root of the neshamas of the bodies, meaning the association of each neshama to its particular body. Like we say, Kedim Arboim Yom Kedim Yitziras Avlad, 40 days before the formation of the child. There's no child yet. There's no conception. It's 40 days before conception, not before birth. What does it say? That the Eibishter is already saying, Pleni ben Pleni to Pleni bas Pleni. He's already designating a shidduch. But there's no body yet. There's no soul yet even. I mean, there's no soul and a body yet. It's not even it's 40 days before conception. Because God in the world of Ak is already preparing the blueprint of what this neshama's destiny will be like, and together with the destiny of its soulmate, of its zivug. The Rebbe speaks about Chafov is 40 days before Yetziras Avlad, 40 days before Rosh Hashanah. So Rosh Hashanah is the actual creation. The truth is, it's Chafei Elul is the actual creation, but Rosh Hashanah is the creation of the child, of the human being. So what's happening on Chafov? So you have the concept. Conceptually, there's already the preparation. So the Fi'erech, before 40 days, you can call that a Keli. Is it an actual Keli? No. The Keli develops in Akudim, not in Ak. But you have both sides of it. So it all comes down to what are we talking about? If you're talking compared to the levels that are completely beyond existence, Atzmi, the Er Atzmi of Pnimi, then that's beyond Shaykhus La'elamus. If you're talking about the Hispashtus of Er that begins to relate to existence, there you're starting to relate to Kalim. So therefore, Ak has, in that sense, some state of Keli, But it's called Sheiresh Neshamas de Gufim, not an actual container like an akudim, but the root of the souls of the bodies is the words he uses here. Shehem hakelim. Neshamas de Gufim, these are the kelim, and here's the root of those kelim. Aval ba'ak atzmei had a sheiresh zeh nikra mekomokim b'chinas kelim da'ak. So even though it's not yet the actual body and soul, the actual kelim, he says in Ak itself, the root is called Mikol Mokim, meaning at the end of the day, it can be called kelim of Ak, because relatively speaking, it's kelim. That's what this actually line is. I think it's an addition, maybe not. I'm looking at 1150. I just want to see. The Ba'al came Mikol Mokim b'chinas kelim. The Friedrich Rebbe adds a few words. But now you see why I'm elaborating, because if I didn't elaborate and you read this, it gets very confusing. Before you said there's no kelim. Now you say there is kelim. What's going on here? And why? But you see here how subtly everything is shifting. Because before we were talking on a different level of the Kav. Compared to that level, Ak is a very sublime level. Well, now we're talking about Ak compared to higher levels, and there Ak is beginning to have the elements, the Sheiresh Neshamas de Gufim, as he puts it here. Okay. The Oyer Hazeh, this Oyer. Now he's going back. What Oyer are we talking about? His Pashtus Oyer. Remember? In etzem of the Oyer Pnimi, the core of the immanent and internalized energy, he said that doesn't have hamshacha or gilui. It's not transmitted. It's not revealed. Be'etzem, fundamentally, it doesn't have ischalkus levels. It doesn't get diminished in its flow. But this Oyer that we're talking about now is Pashtus Oyer, which is the same level of Oyer, but as Oyer as it relates to the functionality of relating to the function of it actually creating and shaping and energizing in an internal way existence and all the elements. Says Ha'er Hazeh, the Ha'er Hazeh, as it extends, it comes in a state of diversity, of levels, of specific levels. Ischalkus. Achu be'erech liyis moker liyesh. To the point that you can call this Oyer a moker liyesh, the source of this created yesh. Like we said about Ak, it's the source, Sheiresh Neshamas de Gufim. So this Oyer, his Pashtus Oyer, it's still Oyer Ein Sof, it's still godly energy. It's not kelim. But this Oyer, because it's extending and it's focusing on its function, its purpose, now you can start calling it the moker to the ayin, to the yesh, which essentially means the ayin of the yesh hanivra, which we'll say in a few lines from now. Or he's going to explain as we go further. Okay. If anybody has questions, because right now he's going to go as following the cue of Ayin Beis, he's going to give now he's going to explain these two levels with the words Pnimiyus Ha'er and Chitzenius Ha'er. So till now we're talking about Etzem Ha'er and Pashtus. He's now going to talk about it in context in the language of Pnimiyus and Chitzenius. The Rebbe Rashab speaks about it only around 5-6 lines. And the Friedrich Rebbe is going to go now good 4 pages explaining the 5. Let me see if it's actually 5 lines. 1 second. It's more than 5, it's 10 lines. 10 lines in the bottom of page 1150, which we learned. Friedrich Rebbe is going to take 4 pages to explain that. So
How could
before I
oil
continue,
pnimi be a etzem? Oil pnimi means already that this is not a etzem. It goes mislabish. That's what pnimi means, no?
didn't I explain this for over an hour yesterday and today? What
I
means the
didn't
etzem
get
of
it.
pnimi?
I didn't get it, but
Really? Can anyone answer that? Anyone in the group here? There was the whole discussion. What means etzem of pnimi? Etzem and ispashus and pnimi. I gave mishalim after mishalim with the mishaleach, does anyone know
I
the
remember
difference? What does
that.
it mean, etzem of pnimi?
Could you say it in one line?
I want to see, 1 second. I want to see if any of the others in the class have an answer to that, because I'm very, if I'd be surprised. I mean, I try to explain it to the best of my ability. Maybe I didn't do it right. Does anyone have an answer to that question? Because this has been the whole discussion. The third interpretation, the second interpretation and the third approach to the ayin is that it's not the two levels of the kav, it's two levels in pnimi. Etzem and ispashtus of pnimi.
Right.
So I've been explaining at length, how could you say an etzem of pnimi when pnimi is designated to relate to existence? Did anybody get what I said or not? I'm not critique. I just want to know. Maybe if nobody got it, then I'll go over it again. But can anybody answer that question? What means the etzem of pnimi when the pnimi by definition is meant to enter internally into existence? Etzem of makiv or etzem of in general, that reflects atzmus. How do you explain that in the pnimi? Anybody?
Can Yapi try?
Please.
Okay, I think I want to preface it. First, we learned in tremendous detail that by Hashem himself, there's no limitation, meaning say true lo gavul means there's no limitation, no limitation of lack of limitation. Etzem is beyond that. God himself is beyond all that. So we also spoke in that context. We spoke about how the panemius is mamish the goal of this love of Atzmus. So his connection with his goal, his intention is to be there entirely with this. So I think that's how how I understand that Atzmus.
If this is the answer, I understand.
Okay, I'm going to just finish. In other words, that because I want to know if I'm right. If the panemius is a goal of Atzmus, it's 100% connected with its source. How exactly that works technically, we're yet to know. But as the mashal of the shliach, the shliach can be totally the mishaleach, and that's what we're talking about here. That's as far as I'd like to try.
Okay.
Okay.
It's how
It's
could
correct.
the oil. If this is the answer, that's fine. Then I understand.
That's correct. I mean, I really elaborate a long time on this, not 5 minutes. I would say designate at least an hour to discuss this, because this is the whole point.
Yeah.
It comes down to the same thing when you talk etzem and ispashtus aver. You cannot think mechanically. These aren't two mechanical parts in a pipe or an electrical current. They're two conceptual states of Ur. Are you focusing on Ur's function, or are you focusing on the kavana of the Ur from the source? When you say etzem Ur, forget about pnimi. All it is a reflection of atzmos. And then when you speak ispashtus lifnei tzimtzum, what do we learn at length for hours? That its focus in lifnei tzimtzum itself, where everything is focused on atzmos, that itself, atzmos is beginning to relate to and wants to consider and deliberate and determine and desire and envision and allocate resources to existence. So it's really two states of Ur. Remember, it's one level of ayin with just two aspects to it. One that relates to the soul. Everything in life is that way. There's what I want, so it's the focus is what I want. And then there's the object of what I want, the desire, the object of the desire. So it's not two pipes, it's two dimensions to Ur. So just like these two dimensions exist in Ur Lifnei Tzimtzum and Ur Bligvul, the same thing, these two levels of Ur exist also in Ur Pnimi. There's the Ur Pnimi as it's reflecting what Atzmus the intention, the kavanas ha'atzmus, or as you just said, correct, in the deepest place it would be yecholte shaloi lahair or yecholte lahair, however you explain it. Bottom line, the yechelas ha'atzmus to manifest in a primisdika way, it's all yechelas ha'atzmus. From that perspective, it's equal to every other yechelas, including the yechelas for bligvul, like we learned. And then there's the focus of that pnimi on the function of that and what is it? To actually enter, to be a hagvul, not a ha'bligvul. But in the first element of etzem, they're all focused on what Atzmus wants of it. And there, all the way in the root, they're all one altogether. Then it becomes two tracks. And in those two tracks, there's two dimensions. There's how the is focused on its source, kavanasas of the source, and how the is focused on what the source wants it to function and do. The ha'bligvul is to create bittul in existence. The ha'gvul is to create existence. So that's the etzem and ispashtus and ha'pnimi. Okay.
Thank you very much. Now it's clear.
Okay.
Yeshakeach Cheskel for reminding me. And thank you, Rav Simon.
No,
Yeah.
I'm glad because I tell you, as a teacher, the last thing you want to know, you're speaking for hours and hours and nobody knows what you're talking about. So that's why it's good to know that. Look, every one of us understands it perhaps on their own terms, but the concept is very.
This point, I forgot it. Okay.
It's
I just needed one reminder. I remember everything.
As I always say, there's no question that's off limits. If I sometimes say it's not something relevant here, it's because it's a good question, but it's not for this mimer. It's like, you have to, and the same thing with every question. Every question is legitimate if a sincere question is coming from a person's question. I'm not problem with the question. I was just wondering whether what I said about this was understood. Okay, so now he moves on to the next step. Is going to explain that these two levels that we're talking about is called Pnimius Ha'er and Chitzenius Ha'er. Obviously, this comes to help us understand what these two levels are. And then he's going to go back and say, this is the Ayin of the Yesh Hamiti, Ayin Yesh Hanivra. And then he's going to begin a further discussion. What is the meaning of the word Ayin? Just give you the lay of the land. So now, the next few pages, as I mentioned, almost 4 pages, 3 pages, 3, 4, is an explanation in these two levels. Here's what he says. After the words "Achahu be'erech li'es maka li'yesh," meaning this expashtus to the point that it becomes and we can consider a source for the yesh because it's relating to the yesh. So ak has both sides, a side where it's receiving from a higher level, and there's a side as it relates to the yesh in different words. But the focus here is not on ak, it's on oir. So let's go back now, he says. Asher beis madreges elu. These two levels that we've been discussing, etzem ha'oir pnimi and ispashtus of the oir. These two madreges by oir pnimi, the two levels in the oir pnimi, in the imminent, internalized energy, hu b'chinas pnimis ha'oir v'chitzenius ha'oir. So he's giving it a name now. It's the inner dimension of energy or light, and chitzenius ha'oir, and the outer dimension. So in other words, it's one oir, but there's the pnimius of it, the inner dimension of it, and there's the outer expression of it. Shehein chalukim zeh mizeh be'etzem mahusam. These two dimensions of oir, inner and outer, are distinguished in a fundamental level, be'etzem mahusam, in their fundamental personality. In other words, it's not just outer and inner, like one thing you look at, the same thing, and it's just an outer and inner. They're fundamentally two different dimensions, but they're still called pnimius and chitzenius. Keep that in mind. They're not called two different worlds. It's an inner and an outer, but they're very different fundamentally. And how are they different? He's going to explain now. This is now the Frierdiker Rebbe's addition. Ayin Beis does not bring this whole discussion now. Now, as I said, the next pages all the way to the top of page, to the bottom of page 111, is the Frierdiker Rebbe's own words. However, I will say it's not from this part of Ayin Beis. I believe it's from other parts of Ayin Beis. I have to look for it more. So Friedrich Rebbe is, but he's bringing it into this discussion here. And he says, V'yuvan rather, will understand this, the difference in Panemius and Chitzenius Ha'er, b'mekolshkein. Mekolshkein means so much more so. How do you say mekolshkein in English? It's like a kal v'chemer, mekolshkein. If it's that way in a certain level, it's certainly that way in the level of Ha'er. So he says, b'mekolshkein, we're going to learn it from mekolshkein me'inyan hakelim. Ba'apnimius v'chitzenius shalahem.
A fortiori. Is how
What?
it's-
A priori. Yeah. The problem is what I don't know what a priori means. I know I've heard it. I've used it. A priori means kal v'chemer. I understand. Okay. But basically, he's going to say we're going to understand Panemius and Chitzenius of Oyer from Panemius and Chitzenius of Kalim. And that's a Mekolshkein, because if it's, however, it's in Kalim, we'll understand how much more so it is in Oyer. Me'in HaKalim, from the Kalim, ba Panemius v'Chitzenius shalahem, from their inner and outer states. So you may recall, back in volume 1 in Ayin Beis, closer to the end, he spoke at length about Panemius and Chitzenius HaKalim. So I believe this is coming from there. I have to look it up. I didn't look it up, but I'm almost sure it's from there. So here's what he says. The Panemius HaKalim, hu etzem u'muhus HaKeli, mashi klei keli l'kabbalah, or klei l'kabbalah. The Panemius of Kalim is, when you say Panemius, it means its inner personality. What is its inner muhus? Mahu. So he says, Etzem muhus HaKeli, the core and personality of the Keli is Mashu Keli l'Kabbalah. What defines a Keli? Why is it called Keli? Because it's a receptacle. It's an entity that receives and absorbs. That's the Etzem and Muhus of a Keli. That doesn't mean a Keli doesn't have other functions and doesn't have other elements. But you talk about the Etzem and Muhus, the Pnimis of the Keli, is it's a Keli l'Kabbalah. It's to receive. When you say Kelim in the Beis HaMikdash, or Kelim in any context, the Keli is meant to hold something, to contain something. That's what the container means. That's what a Keli is, a Keli for something. As soon as you say the word Keli, you say, what is it a Keli for? What is it containing? What is it receiving? What is it absorbing? V'hainu, the kol inyana, this means kol inyana, the whole inyan, the whole idea, the whole personality or concept of a Keli hu lekabel la'atzma, is that it should receive la'atzma, it should receive something to itself. Interesting, the word la'atzma, he could have just said inyana hu lekabel la'atzma. I guess it means to internalize it. So like you say a Talmud, it's to internalize it within itself. L'kabel la'atzma means to receive it within itself. The Ayin Yana, to just explain this further, he's going to say what it's not. The Ayin Yana, its function, its job, its personality is Ayin Yana klal lashpia chutz la'atzma. It's not. Its inyan is not at all to lashpia, to transmit it outside of itself. Keli, by definition, is to receive within itself. Here I am. I'm now a Keli to absorb something else within me. And it's the inyan of the Keli is not to extend it elsewhere, not to send it anywhere, not to transmit. It's not a transmitter, it's a receiver. That's Pnimis HaKeli, meaning the inner core of what the essence of what a container really is. I always explain it with the concept of Chazara, that when we listen to the Rebbe and when you learn something properly, the true definition of a Keli is to be a clay reikon, an empty receptacle to receive and absorb, and not to process. You're not here to transmit. You're not here to process. You're here only to receive. Like boyer sud she'eina ma'abed tipa, like a container that does not lose one drop. All it is to absorb whatever is being transmitted into it.
You also
The
the coast very often. The coast when you fill it up, and then Sony is when you pour it.
We're going to read. Now we're going to talk about the chitzenius. The chitzenius hakeli, the outer dimension of the keli, hu lifel ul hashpia. It's to affect and to transmit. So primis hakeli is only to receive and absorb, and not at all to transmit. Chitzenius hakeli is to lifel, is to affect something. It's to cause something. Ul hashpia, and to transmit. Shezev chutz la'atzma. That is outside of itself. So like you just said, yes, the example would be a kos. You pour a cup of wine, kiddush. So the premise of the keli is that it holds the wine. That's the main function. Its only function. The chitzenius of the keli is when you drink it or you pour it to others. Because then it's serving something. It's giving to another. So pneumius is the receiving part. And he calls that's the whole inyan and mohus of it. And the chitzenius is its functionality and it's the impact or the effect it's having and its transmission outside of itself. Mashenkin primis hakeli, hurak mashi keli lekabala. The inner dimension is only that it's a recipient. Shirak la'atzma, which means it's only for itself. It's not to give to others. Vahainu, this means the zeu mohuse shalakeli. This is the personality, the mahu. What is the keli? Mashihirak kli lekabala or keli lekabala. That it's only a container to receive. That's the premise of the keli, and he calls that the mohus of the keli. Now he's going to give the example that we just said. Ukamoy al derech moshel, like for example, page 109. Hakos sheneshin beyayin, a cup, a kos in which you pour wine, or shar mashkin, or other drinks, or other liquids. It could be water, it could be juice, it could be many things. Hariyah pnimi shaloi, the pnimi of this keli, this kos. What is, if you said the pnimi of it? I'm sorry, the pnimis hakeli, hu hateich sheboy. That's the inside of the kos. You look at the inside of the kos, hateich, the inside like shu acholol umokim pone. That's the whole and empty space, which is, if a keli doesn't have that, it's not a keli. If a keli is a flat entity, it's not going to contain anything. Nothing will be able to be poured into it. It has to be an empty receptacle. That's what a kos is, an empty space where you could pour something into it. So he calls this now cholol umokim pone. I know it sounds like this cholol umokim ponim of the tzimtzum, but let's not talk about that right for now, even though there is some similarity. But bottom line is, the keli is a chol umokim asher boy mekabel es hayayin b'teiche. In this space, in this empty space, within it he will receive the yayin within it. So he says, in this part of the keli, the pnimi, hariyateich hu ha'ikr. That inner is the ikr. Ubilodai hateich lo yoya keli klal. And without that inner space, the teich, the inside of the cup, it's not a keli at all. Obviously, if the cup would be stuffed, or it wouldn't have an empty space, or it's filled with something else, it's not a keli then. V'kol inyan hateich hurak la'atzmei. And the whole inyan, the whole idea, the whole concept of this inner, the inside of the cup, is only for yourself. Because when you pour something in the cup, it's not in somebody else's cup. It's only for this cup to hold, not for another cup. We're talking about this keli. Now he says, "Umasha idea kos sheisim esayayin." And what about the fact, and what about that through the kos you drink the wine? Remember, then you take the cup, you put it to your lips, and you drink it. So that's not la'atzmei. The cup is not just for itself. You're drinking, another person is benefiting from it. He says, "Hu rach chitzenius hakeli bilvad." That part, when you take the cup and put it to your lips and drink it, that is the chitzenius of the keli. The toich is the primus of the keli. Shari eineno atzmus muhus hakeli kim chitzenius bilvad. That lip of the cup that you put to your mouth and allows you to drink from it, that's not the atzmus muhus. That's not the essence and the core of the container. That's only an outer dimension of it. If you only had a lip and you didn't have an empty cup, it wouldn't be a keli. In other words, if the keli was only able to allow you to drink, but it cannot be filled with anything, then it's missing the whole point. So there is a chitzenius to the keli, which is how the keli serves, and you're able to drink from it or pour from it. But the essence of the keli, what defines a keli, is not that you're drinking from it. What defines a keli is its ability to hold and contain something within it. The drinking from it, that's the function of the container, not the essence of the container. The function of the container, what it affects or functions and functions, it causes something outside of itself. In this case, the one who's drinking the wine. Ulechein, hine legabe tuma, Friedrich Rebbe is bringing our rai from Nigla. And that's why legabe tuma, when it comes to impurification, we know that a keli can become impure. A keli due to different tumas. So legabe tuma, yesh hefresh ben teichish al keli v'gabe. When it comes to tuma, there's a difference between what's the inside of the keli, and v'gabe means the outside of it. So in other words, you could have a tumor that only affects the outside and not the inside. I think the other way around too, if I recall. Why? Because they're two different parts. If the keli was one entity, meaning then it should all have a tumor, should affect everything. But since the keli has two elements to it, one is its etzem ochus, which is the actual container, and the second is its function as it impacts something else, not as containing for itself, but impacting, drinking from it, and so on. So the keli has two different dimensions. That's why the tumor could affect one and not the other. I have to look it up, and Masechta Kelim talks about this. I think that if something tamei touches the keli on the outside, the question is the whole keli tamei or not? I recall there's situations where it's not. Anybody has a recollection? I'll look it up, but just...
I think it's clay Harris is nitma mitocho and not michutzo. And clay matches is become tamei on both sides. That's my recollection how that works.
Okay, fine. So I'll just read, the truth is, we could stop here, but I'll just read two more lines just to finish this sentence. This difference in the keli as it relates to others, and the keli as it relates to itself, is the difference between the primis and the chitzeni, is the inner and outer dimension. The inner part of the keli, the inner dimension, is the core essence and its personality, which is a clay Kabbalah. It's all about receiving for itself. The outer dimension of the keli is the functionality, the function of the container. That's only the outer dimension of the keli and not the inner core. Okay, he's going to qualify and explain it further. Let's stop here. It's the top of page 109. So we're explaining the inner and outer dimension of keli in order to understand the inner and outer dimension of oir, which is the two levels of ayin, the etzem and hispashtus of eir. So we'll get back to, of course, he's going to come back to it. But right now we're in the middle of understanding how it works in kalim, which actually makes it easier to understand when you talk about a keli. Okay.